From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Meche breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
It's come down to this. All the signings, all the trades, all the rumors, all the lying. It's all come down to tonight, the NFL draft. We talked about last week, specifically with the New Orleans Saints and what we think could happen. I talked with Ross Jackson of the Locked On Saints podcast, but for this edition of Cleats and Sneaks, I want to look at the NFL as a whole and what we could see, all types of scenarios. I know that there's going to be plenty of trade ups and trade downs with teams, and who better to talk about that than the host of the Locked On NFL podcast, as well as the Peacock of the Peacock and Williamson show. It's Brian Peacock. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm pumped for the fake drafts to end and the real draft to begin.
Right. I feel like with mock drafts, when you do the first like 5 or 6, the months ahead and weeks ahead, it's all just whatever. But really, the one that you do the week of the NFL draft, that's the one that really matters.
Yeah. And what's frustrating about the whole process was two things. With mock drafts, it's frustrating because the guys with the real good inside information, they don't put out their best mock draft, their most accurate mock draft until the morning of the real draft. And then it's like too late. And it's like, well, I can wait a couple more hours for the real draft to happen. I want to know who has the most accurate mock drafts in like February when you're really starting for it and the draft is a ways out. Like, I don't care who has the best mock draft on the morning of the actual draft, because I'll just wait for the real thing to actually happen. And then the other thing that happens is most of these mock drafts are so far off because we get into this weird media group think and it all becomes kind of one big media consensus draft board. And each one of the 32 teams is just so wildly different that it makes it so hard to predict. And then all of a sudden you get the domino effect of, if right now everyone thinks it's going to be Jane Daniels. If Jane Daniels ends up not going to, and it's a different quarterback, well, that might change everything all the way down because maybe one team doesn't like another quarterback, and then that guy gets taken, and then another team doesn't want to trade up for their quarterback because he's gone. And so it just all changes the entire dynamic of the whole draft, which was what makes it fun. And it's funny because some fans will read a mock draft and go like, this draft sucks because it's so unrealistic. This could never happen. And it's like, have you never watched the draft? The real draft is going to be way more insane than the most insane mock draft you read before the real thing.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's definitely weird because if you don't have a consensus first like 5 or 6, if something happens, say with the Patriots, and we'll bring this up in a couple minutes, but say the Patriots don't take Drake May or don't take JJ McCarthy, or they don't trade down, and it ends up being someone like Marvin Harrison Jr. that ends up going 3, that completely changes everything.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect example. So you go through and you try to like get in the mind of each team. So if I feel like the teams that would really love Jaden Daniels are Washington and the New York Giants, but I think the Patriots and especially the Vikings would probably lean more toward potentially JJ McCarthy, more timing based systems and Shanahan McVay tree coaches. And so I could see those teams, if Daniels falls, not being as interested. And the idea that so if the Patriots are willing to move out of 3, then how come they haven't already moved out? Well, they're waiting to see if the quarterback they like is there. But if they're willing to trade, then that means there's a chance that the quarterback they like is not there. So let's say that's Drake May. So what if Drake May goes too? Well, now the Patriots are willing to trade. Well, does that mean the Giants move up then if they're the better fit for Jaden Daniels, and then the Vikings are waiting on JJ McCarthy? And so it just really all can change because it's not like we act like when we're mock drafting that every team is going to love all 4 quarterbacks the same. And we know that's not going to be the case. And it's the same with the offensive tackles. You go through the draft and it's like, okay, Saints need an offensive tackle. Who's the next one on my list? Lise Fuaga. That's
right.
It's tackle need, tackle player, done. But not every team views each tackle the same. Some might view Fuaga as a guard. Some teams might want a left tackle and he plays right tackle. And they might think he's a right tackle in the NFL, so they like Olu Fashanu a little bit better. So that's what's fascinating to all of it about me is you get this one consensus board, but every team is going to view all these prospects different, and the fits and the stylistic fits for different players is going to be completely different for every team and every scheme.
I think in a perfect example, when you brought up the Saints and maybe like Fuaga because of this, but someone else might not. It really comes down to the big boards and where do they view everyone? Because I think a perfect example was a couple of years ago. We had done a live draft reaction with one of my coworkers, and he was completely dumbfounded when they took Peyton Turner because so many people had Peyton Turner as like a third round prospect, and he was taken in the late first by the Saints.
That's a really interesting area of the draft. And I cover the 49ers very closely. And John Lynch just did his pre-draft press conference and he let it be known. I was going to say he let it slip, but he was very honest about, what the 49ers draft board looks like. And he said that, and I think it's probably pretty similar for a lot of teams, give or take a prospect or two. But he said they had 22 first round grades. And usually what that means is the players that would be in the first round of just about any draft ever. And so usually that ends up being somewhere around 20, 18, 19, 20, 22, 24, something like that, right? And so at 31, 32, 30, 28, you're very unlikely to be drafting a clean first round prospect. So once those, for the 49ers example, and it's probably the same for a lot of teams that are drafting at the end of round one, once those clean first round grades are off the board, I mean, there could be a huge tier of players that you're choosing from. And the consensus media might think that a player is a third round guy, but he's your favorite of this next tier of non-first round players. And you're going to have to draft somebody who's non-clean first round prospect, very likely at the end of round one. And that's when you get the Peyton Turners of the world. And you get a lot of draft pick. You get Cole Strange a couple of years ago for the New Patriots, right? And everyone's like, third round pick. And it was hilarious because the Rams didn't have a first round pick. They haven't had a first round pick forever until this year. They were doing like a little live show because with McVay and Les Snead, the GM. And it was so funny because they're live doing this local draft show because other teams are drafting and they don't have a pick until the third round. And Cole Strange gets selected, and Sean McVay looks over at Les Snead. He's like, well, there he goes. We were hoping to get him in the third round, and now he's gone. So they had a third round grade on him too, but they liked him in the third round. So it just, every team's board's going to be wildly different. And once you get out of that tier of clean first round prospects, just about anything can happen in any order. And a guy that another team views as the 70th best player might be your 31st best player.
Now, you bring up orders, and it feels like the consensus, and I know we had talked about that with the media wise, but it feels like the consensus is Caleb Williams at 1 to Chicago, Jaden Daniels at 2 to Washington, and then at 3, depending on whoever you want to put there, whether the Patriots stay there or not, is Drake May. Do you think that is how the first 3 picks go?
At this point, you would have to bet that that's the way things go. And I kind of root for chaos sometimes. So again, if it's the scenario that I talked about before, which I think it is, I kind of want Drake May to go 2, because then you have 2 very different stylistic quarterbacks in Jaden Daniels and JJ McCarthy. And there might be more opportunity for teams to move in and out. And maybe it's more likely for, say, the Patriots to move out of 3 at that point. And I still have a hard time believing that the Minnesota Vikings are really going to spend 3 first-round picks to go up from 11 all the way to number 4, say, to draft J.J. McCarthy. And maybe they are, and it's a good fit, I think. But, man, that's a lot to give up. And as we know, thinking about the 2021 quarterback class, and only one of the 5 first-round quarterbacks is even on the same team just a couple of years later that drafted him, right? And so you're going to spend 3 first-round picks on that? So it's a coin flip, and you just can't ever know. But one thing J.J. McCarthy has going for him is that I think if you start to ask yourself, and it's not an easy thing to answer, but if what really matters for becoming a great quarterback in the NFL is what's going on from the neck up, and are you a grinder? Are you a battler? Are you a winner? Are you a leader? And all these things, and you're not going to sleep unless you do everything you can to win the next football game. He seems to have a lot of that, and I think that's one of the things that's winning over a lot of front offices. So maybe he is the guy that could end up being the top quarterback in this class. If you're just trying to evaluate and get into a prospect's head, he seems to check a lot of those types of boxes.
And I find it interesting because with Arizona, if they were to trade down, because it feels like it's a very likely chance that they do so. Minnesota, of course, seems like the likely chance of them to do it because they traded to get the number 23 pick as well, and they would package that in 11 to go up to 4 as well as package up some other stuff. But it really comes down to, does Arizona want to fall down that far? Because if they're not able to get a receiver that they really like, they're kind of worsening their chances of doing that. Whereas if they move down to 6 with New York, they still have a pretty good opportunity of taking either Marvin Harrison Jr. or maybe they just really like Malik Neighbors, but they wanted to get him at a better money price.
One of my favorite draft scenarios is Monty Fort pulling the maneuver he pulled last year again, and not being able to pass up the opportunity to get all that extra draft capital for a team like Minnesota that might be trying to get up to number 4. And maybe you miss out on Marvin Harrison Jr. if that's your number 1 wide receiver, but they could potentially still come all the way back up and get a receiver. They could go up to number 8 with the Falcons, who I think would be a team absolutely looking to get down at that point. So could they just go back up from 11 to 8 and get Rome Odunze or something like that? So that's a scenario I love for the Arizona Cardinals. And I think it's probably an enticing enough scenario that they wouldn't be willing to say no to a massive draft haul for a team trying to come all the way up to number 4.
Do you think that the Chargers end up staying at 5? Do you think they have a really prime opportunity and very likely to end up trading down?
I think it's kind of similar where if it turns out that say the Vikings scoff at the asking price by the Arizona Cardinals, that they could end up going up to number 5 instead to get their quarterback, because it could cost, I mean, each pick starts to cost a lot less. And I think it would really behoove the Los Angeles Chargers to come down and collect more picks and rebuild this thing. And, you know, Jim Harbaugh is competitive and he wants to win. But if you told Jim Harbaugh, look, man, we're going to get more ammunition, we're going to get an extra first round pick, and we can draft a wide receiver later. But guess what? When we go back to 11, now we can draft you a butt kicking offensive tackle that's 340 pounds. How's that sound at number 11? Like JC Latham's going to be there for you. Fuaga's going to be there for you at 11. How does that sound? And we'll still get you a wide receiver later. I think you'd be going like, yeah, let's go.
And then I'm kind of curious when it comes to the pass catchers, because I played wide receiver when I played football, and it's very intriguing for me. I know Brian Thomas, he probably will go between that 10 and 20 range. I had him going to Cincinnati. It just made a lot of sense with the LSU connection, as well as we're not quite sure what's going to happen with T. Higgins, but Malik Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., and Rome Odunze, all top 3 guys, as well as Brock Bowers out of Georgia. Those are the top 4 pass catchers in this draft. Do you have specific teams or maybe landing spots that you think they'll end up going to?
I like the Cincinnati pick by you too, because I think stylistically winning on the outside, a pure X type of wide receiver, I think that'd be a perfect fit to eventually replace T. Higgins. And who knows, T. Higgins might get traded, early the next morning before the second round starts, or during the second round, or maybe at the end of round 1. There's potentially a trade with him on the franchise tag too. So he might not even be a Cincinnati Bengal after this weekend, especially if the right wide receiver falls to them in a certain scenario. So I like that fit quite a bit. I do think there's the dark horse wide receiver to go higher than people expect to be like the wow selection on Thursday night is Xavier Worthy, because I know he's showing up in second round of mock drafts, but a guy that runs 4.2 and was as productive as he was. And, a lot of the reports from coaches that, he was the guy, like he was the leading receiver there. And when you run 4.21, you go high. The same thing happened with John Ross. Like, was he a late first round pick? No, he went number 9 overall, right? It's just teams are enamored with that speed, and he's got as much as anybody we've seen in recent history. So I don't think anybody should be shocked if Xavier Worthy's even the 4th wide receiver off the board in this draft, and not be shocked if he goes higher than his teammate with some character, some medical concerns now with Mitchell popping up.
Yeah. Is Michael Penix, do you think he's a lock for the first round? Because a lot of people, we know about the first 4 quarterbacks, and I know that people are concerned about the injury history, but when you watch him on tape, he just feels like he's a confident guy that can make those throws, and he's always willing to take the checkdowns as much as he loves throwing the deep.
Yeah, he's got a great arm. He's been through a lot. I love the quote he had the other day, and he had a statement about his prospects in the NFL draft. And man, I wish I could remember exactly what he said because it was phenomenal. But he's got all the arm you need. I think part of it was the injury stuff with him, and he had basically his quote was, "I know that I had 4 seasons that ended due to injury, but I put together 2,000 snaps or 2,000 I think 2,000 snaps or whatever it was since then to prove that I am healthy and can stay healthy. And what's important is not MRIs and X-rays, it's the EKG because you can't measure a prospect's heart. That's what's going to matter for me." And so I thought it was a phenomenal, a message to NFL teams. That
Right.
said, I don't think he's even close to a first round lock. If I had to guess, I would say he ends up going in the second round, and I would say Bo Nix might go closer to the third round than the first round, if I had to guess, because we get this every year where we think all these quarterbacks are going to go really high, and teams are going to trade up into the first round to get them. And with quarterbacks especially, and we've seen this going back to the 2021 quarterback class now, the Jaguars wouldn't trade Trevor Lawrence for anything, but the other teams couldn't get almost anything for their quarterbacks. Like when you're a quarterback, you're either worth everything or nothing. It's pretty wild. So if a team sees a quarterback prospect as, man, this is a no doubt NFL starting quarterback, then I'm going to scratch and claw and climb to get this guy on my football team. And I don't know if that's the evaluation for teams. And all it takes is one. So maybe there is, and if not, then you're kind of like, okay, this guy's a high-end backup probably. Maybe he develops into a starter. If he's still there for us in round 2, round 3, then we'll pull that trigger because we kind of have to at that point, but we're not going to spend extra resources to go up and trade up for a guy and tie our future to this quarterback that we're not sure that he's going to be a high-end starter in the NFL.
So because I know a lot of lines had how many quarterbacks are going in the first round. The line was 4.5. So
Yeah.
you're saying you think it's going to be 4 at the
Yeah.
end by the end of it all.
Yep, I'm under on that. And Matt Williamson and I did a draft props episode on, I don't even know what the so Monday. That was when that episode was on Peacock and Williamson, and that was one of them. I think I would take the under on that
Okay.
for sure. Yeah,
Um, do you think that the or not the Chargers? Do you think the Raiders are just the ultimate fit in the second round to take Penix? And then it feels like with the Broncos as well. I know that they just got Zach Wilson, so it doesn't feel like they need to trade up, and they could just take take a tackle to replace Garrett Bowles at 12, and then in the third round, like you said with Bo Nix, you could take him there.
yeah. That would be my guess. If I had to like place prospects with teams, I would put Penix with the Raiders in round 2 and Bo Nix with the Broncos in round 3. I think those would be really nice spots, really good fits for those teams. And I do think there's even a little smoke screen involved with the Broncos maybe being up to something and bringing in a quarterback this week for almost nothing, just to kind of make teams think that maybe they're not really super interested in the quarterback and they're good there, because there's no way they could not be interested in the quarterback still. When you look at their quarterback room, it's like, what are you up to, Sean Payton? So maybe he really likes Zach Wilson. I don't know. I think I don't think it changes anything for what their plans are. And who knows, maybe they can go up. But one of the interesting parts of this draft is, which helps probably the New York Giants and the Minnesota Vikings the most, is that the Chargers at 5, they're not going to trade back with either the Broncos or the Raiders to let them come up and get a quarterback of the future, right? So they kind of can control if let's say 3 quarterbacks have gone and then Marvin Harrison, and now the Chargers are on the clock. Well, they can control which team gets that quarterback, and it sure as heck isn't going to be the Denver Broncos or the Las Vegas Raiders in their division. So either they swap back one spot with the Giants, who I can see that being a move for them to still get the player they would have gotten, and the Giants can thwart any trade up attempts, or the Vikings obviously coming all the way up to number 5 and drafting someone like JJ McCarthy there. And I do think the Giants are the dark horse team here. I can't really figure out what direction they want to go, because they need to upgrade at quarterback. But as they sit at 6, it's a really good spot to just sit back and let a really good prospect come to you, probably a wide receiver like Malik Neighbors too. So, you don't feel like you have to go make a move, but if they can make a minor move to go up to 4 or 5, I could see that definitely. And maybe, who knows, maybe the Patriots and Giants could swing a move, and the Patriots or the Giants end up going up to 3 for Jaden Daniels if Washington shocks some folks and goes with a different quarterback at 2.
And I hear a lot of people talking about the Chargers, how they just have all the leverage depending on what happens. Well, if you're not going to trade with your division foes, with the Raiders and the Broncos, like you mentioned, like what leverage do you have? Because then it's just a one-man race basically with the Minnesota Vikings if they don't trade with Arizona, and New York doesn't trade up to 3 or 4 either to go get a quarterback, and you still have that quarterback on the board.
Yeah,
I find that one interesting because at that point, if you're not able to get the capital that you would want for number 5, and you have to trade down to 11 and 23, do you not just take Joe Alt and you just bolster up that offensive line even more? Because that's kind of the direction they've been going in. I know a lot of people want to take a wide receiver, but the way that they've approached free agency, they've just been getting defensive linemen, tackles, and tight ends, and they haven't really worried about the wide receiver.
yeah, and maybe that's because they know they're in a prime spot to get a wide receiver, so they're kind of preparing the rest of their roster, knowing that they're going to plug in that wide receiver at 5. But I agree with you that, and that's why I think it's going to be a lot cheaper for the Vikings to go to 5 instead of 3 or 4. Even though it's only a couple picks, it could be the difference of an entire first round pick. Like if they could probably get to 5 without giving up their future first and just the 2 firsts this year. And so maybe that's what the Vikings are thinking. And maybe the Vikings are willing to just wait and say, okay, we'll call your bluff at 4. And, if you get a better offer than what we're offering, Cardinals, fine, then trade out of that spot. And really they know that it's very unlikely to happen. Although I will say this, if you were the Cardinals and you're Monty Austinfort and you get offers from the Vikings, which is 2 firsts this year, 11 and 23, and then a 2025 first round pick, or you get offers of 3 first round picks, but that would be in, the next 2 years from the Broncos or the Raiders. Even though the Vikings have the 2 picks this year, those firsts, especially next year, could be higher with the Broncos or the Raiders. Like you might end up in a better situation where you end up with the number 1 overall pick. So I wonder what offer you would choose if you were Arizona and you had those 3 offers on the clock for 3 firsts, the next 3 first round picks from both the Viking or all 3 of the Vikings, the Broncos, and the Raiders. Which one would you choose?
I feel like if I was the Chargers GM, I feel like I might have to take the latter pick, because it'd be nice to have 2 picks in the first round this draft, but if you still got picks for next year as well, why not have multiple first rounders in 2025 and in 2026, as well as still being able to have a relatively high pick in this year's draft as well?
Yeah, because I'd be willing to bet that. And I know he did a great job as an interim head coach last year with the Raiders, but I think roster-wise, the Raiders are more likely to have a really bad year.
Yeah.
And, Sean Payton's roster isn't much better with the Denver Broncos. And, maybe after the changes they made this offseason, maybe it's even worse. I don't know. But I like the Vikings' chances of earning I like the Vikings' chances of having a better record next year than those other 2 teams. So maybe that's a more enticing trade offer from one of those other teams.
Especially since the AFC feel like it's a lot more loaded. It feels like it's a lot more competitive compared to the NFC, where yes, if the Vikings make a couple good picks, all of a sudden they're in contention of being in the playoffs, compared to it's going to take a lot more for that AFC West division to really get it together. Looking more towards the NFC West, not necessarily the 49ers as of yet, but it's really intriguing to see what happens with not only the Arizona Cardinals, but the Los Angeles Rams and the Seattle Seahawks, what they do with their middle of the first round picks. Because Aaron Donald has retired, and you also look at the Seattle Seahawks, and they could go in multiple different directions.
The Seahawks are fascinating. And by the way, another good landing spot for Michael Penix with his college offensive coordinator now being on the staff of the Seattle Seahawks. And if you are the Seahawks and you ask Grubb, you ask him, you were the offensive coordinator for the Washington Huskies last year. Who was the most important piece, right? And he'd be like, well, I'd love to get Odunze, but he's not going to be there. But what about Altanu, right? So that's a player I like there. They have their tackles. Do you draft them? They do need interior offensive linemen. Is that too early to draft an interior offensive lineman? Could they be a dark horse team for Michael Penix? That's probably the ceiling for Michael Penix. I would think maybe he could go 12 or 13. I don't know. I don't buy him as a first round guy. We'll see what ends up happening there. I do think it's telling though, and this is this is fascinating too. Where the Washington Commanders brought in quarterbacks, and they did like a top golf outing or something, and they wanted to just kind of see them all together. And they invited Jaden Daniels, who was kind of miffed because he thought it was going to be a private workout or a private visit, and it ended up being all these quarterbacks together. Drake May, JJ McCarthy, and Michael Penix. So they invited Michael Penix, but not Bo Nix. So does that tell us that NFL teams view Michael Penix closer to the first group of quarterbacks and not like a gap? Or I don't know what it would. I don't know if that tells us anything, or if we are looking too much into that. But maybe teams do like Michael Penix more than I think they do. Who knows?
Now, there's a couple of things that could happen with the 49ers. I know that early on in free agency, it was all about Brandon Ayuk, and he's probably going to get traded to the Steelers or a different team on the opposite side of the country or in the opposite conference. But then recently he was like, no, I don't want to get traded. And they're talking about, well, we just want to get a deal done. But he also had posted on a story recently on social media that there's going to be fireworks going on draft night coming from him. So I'm wondering, have you heard anything from either him or from other sources around the team that there's a good chance that he gets traded on draft night, like what we had seen with AJ Brown a couple of years back?
I think it's certainly possible. And the latest reporting from Michael Silver, formerly of NFL Network. He writes for the San Francisco Chronicle now, and he's really plugged in and has had really good information on the 49ers in free agency. And recently he's been on everything that's going on with the 49ers. So I trust his reporting. And he doesn't report that anything's imminent, but he says kind of be prepared for anything. Like it could go either way, and it might be just a matter of, is a team willing to meet the 49ers very high asking price? And if a team meets that, then the 49ers would feel that that it's necessary to take that serious and maybe make a move just because of the realities of their roster and paying so many expensive players, and Brock Purdy's coming up next. And they have a lot of expensive players, and they're probably not going to pay Debo and Ayuk at the same time, even though I still think they can re-sign Ayuk and still not end up paying him at the same time, because Debo could be a trade candidate next year, and you could structure it where they're not hitting actually fully at the same time, which is basically what's going on in Philadelphia. Because I keep getting asked, it's like, well, how come the Eagles can pay 2 wide receivers? And it's like, well, look at the years that they're being paid to, and it's not going to overlap, right? And so the teams are really good with manipulating the cap and making those things not hit at the same time. So, and the 49ers are in that win now Super Bowl mode. They're not going to go trade a guy they think is a really integral part of winning a Super Bowl just to get an extra pick in the future that might be a good player in 3 years, right? So they want to win now. I think there's a very low chance that Ayuk is actually traded, because 2 reasons. I don't think they really want to trade him, and I don't know if a team's going to pony up what they would be asking for. But as we saw with the DeForest Buckner trade, if a team meets the value of what they think is more than what Brandon Ayuk gives them, then they'd probably be willing to swing that deal. And so it'd probably be a pretty extensive haul. Mike Silver noted that, potentially it's first round value that they're asking for, and that one executive said they're asking for too much. But he also said that it could end up being maybe a couple of second round picks or something that gives them that first round value they're looking for. And so then you start looking at a team like Washington. It's like, okay, well, you might draft a quarterback at 2, and then you have 2 picks early in the second round, 36 and 40, and your GM just came from San Francisco. Could that be a team that swings the deal? I don't know if wide receiver is necessarily the big need for the Washington Commanders there, and worthy of giving up those 2 picks, but that would be, close to the same value of, the first round pick you might be asking for from, say, the Steelers at 20. What's the value there? Pretty similar, probably. So some interesting things could happen in the draft for sure. I would think Brandon Ayuk does not end up getting traded, though.
We're wrapping up our conversation with Brian Peacock of the Peacock and Williamson show, as well as Locked On NFL, and he also covers the 49ers for the Locked On 49ers podcast as well. Brian, do you have any specific predictions or ideas that you think are a real possibility out there that maybe people aren't thinking about, that maybe there's a trade that we haven't talked about yet, or maybe there's a guy that's going somewhere that no one's really mocked?
I would say, so the Xavier Worthy thing is a big one. And I could see a team like the Dallas Cowboys at 24, trying to pair a speedier receiver with CD Lamb long-term. that one kind of makes sense for me. Xavier Worthy at 24 of the Cowboys and kind of shock some folks. And by the way, I didn't answer your question about the fireworks from Ayuk's Instagram.
Mhm.
So that, in my opinion, was reference to his old college teammate, Jaden Daniels, who was his quarterback at Arizona
Oh,
State back in 2020. And I think that's what he was talking about there, as like, his buddy's about to get drafted really high
okay.
before he transferred over to LSU. So that's the fireworks thing, I think, from Brandon Ayuk. I also think Brandon Ayuk's having a little fun with the media, with some of the stuff,
Just messing with us.
which I totally appreciate, and absolutely something I would be doing. If people are like looking at your Instagram follows daily, I think that's something that you could have a lot of fun with fans and media throughout this process, just to keep yourself sane, knowing that everyone else is kind of going insane through the process. I'm trying to think if there's any more really shocking things there's going to be a ton of shocking things, and it's going to throw everybody off. And I love those moments, and they're so hard to predict because teams are lying about who they love and who they don't love. That
Yeah.
team that you don't expect that trades up from the 20s all the way into the top 10 or something like that. Those kind of moves are going to be really fun. I do think that, 3, 4, 5 spot, there's going to be a move there, whether it's the Giants or the Vikings, to go get a quarterback. And I do think there's a big possibility that a team goes up with Atlanta or, around pick 8. So there should be a couple of nice trades in the top 10 to look out for sure.
Brian, appreciate you coming on. Also, on draft day, I know that it's highly regarded as a terrible movie, but do you ever watch draft day? Because that's kind of like a tradition for me.
Yeah, actually, my wife happened to have, I don't know why she put it on. She doesn't even care about football, but she had draft day on about a month ago. And I kind of stopped and started watching it with her. And I was like, oh, I haven't seen this in a long time. I definitely am not one to put draft day on because it's a bad movie. And
Yeah.
I was just kind of laughing at it. And I hadn't seen it since it came out. But I can see why people would want to throw that on just to have a little fun, just to get themselves in the right mindset for the NFL draft. It's such a ridiculous movie though. It's like, especially with the way the draft is such a science now, with how serious it is and what teams do and what they're allowed to do, and what trades make sense and what don't, and how teams deal with each other. It's just such an outlandish idea that a GM could pull off and do what he does in that movie, which is really the tough part as far as the movie goes. Whatever, it's a fine movie, I guess.
Yeah.
Appreciate Kevin Costner, who actually went to a high school in my old hometown of Visalia, California.
Oh,
Appreciate him throwing out all the sports movies, though. Not his best, though.
no, no. Brian, appreciate you coming on. This was a great conversation. It's time that we're finally able to figure out what happens on Thursday night.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pumped for it. Thanks for having me on, James.
Thank you. And that was Brian Peacock of the Peacock and Williamson show, as well as Locked On NFL and Locked On 49ers. Don't forget to like and subscribe to not only their YouTube channels, but our own ESPN Southwest Louisiana. Also, check out any one of our other podcasts like Four Tire Change with Dawson Iserlo or The Miguez Mindset with Matt Miguez. Like, subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell that we get notifications anytime we upload any one of our podcasts. Talk to you next week.